In the dust-covered streets of Saints' Cross, a small frontier town, a priest kneels in silent prayer before his church. When the notorious Morgan brothers storm in, demanding a duel, none of them realize they're challenging the legendary ghost hand McGraw, the deadliest gunslinger west of the Mississippi who disappeared 5 years ago. Some say he killed 30 men in a single year. Others claim he could draw and fire before his opponent's fingers even twitched. But for the past 5 years, Father Thomas has devoted himself to peace and redemption. Now, as the morning sun casts long shadows across the church steps, he must decide, maintain his vows of peace, or reveal the deadly skills he's fought so hard to bury. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning bells of Saints' Cross Church ring out across the valley, their sound carrying over sun-baked adobe walls and weather-worn wooden structures. Father Thomas Matthews stands at the altar, his weathered hands carefully arranging the communion bread. The early morning light filters through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows that dance across the deep scars on his hands. Scars, he's told his congregation, came from years of missionary work. The truth behind those scars, like many things about Father Thomas, remains carefully hidden beneath his pristine black cassock and collar. The same hands that now distribute communion once earned him the nickname Ghost Hand for their lightning-quick draw. The same voice that delivers sermons once commanded a gang of outlaws across 3 territories. But that was another life, one he buried alongside his guns in an unmarked grave outside Tombstone. The peaceful routine of his morning prayers is interrupted by the heavy thud of boot heels on wooden steps. Father Thomas doesn't need to turn around to know something is wrong. 5 years of living on the edge have honed instincts that even a priest's collar couldn't dull. The church door crashes open, flooding the shadowy interior with harsh morning light. 3 men enter, their spurs jingling against the wooden floor. The Morgan brothers, infamous for their quick tempers and quicker triggers. Their reputation for violence has spread across 3 territories, leaving a trail of widows and burning buildings in their wake. The eldest, Jake Morgan, leads the way, his silver-plated revolvers gleaming at his hips. Behind him, the twins Tom and Bill finger their gun belts nervously, their eyes darting around the church interior as if expecting an ambush. "Well, well, if it ain't the holy man himself," Jake's voice echoes off the church walls, irreverent and mocking. "Heard you've been preaching against our business ventures in town, telling folks not to pay for our protection. That ain't very Christian of you, Father." Father Thomas continues arranging the communion bread, each movement deliberate and measured. His voice, when he speaks, carries the calm authority of a man who has faced far worse than local thugs. "The only protection these people need is from those who would exploit them, Mr. Morgan. I simply remind them of this truth." Jake Morgan's laugh is sharp and humorless. "Truth? Let me tell you about truth, Father. Truth is, this town needs order. Truth is, someone's got to keep the peace. And truth is, you're interfering with legitimate business." Father Thomas finally turns, his dark eyes meeting Jake's gaze. Something in that steady look makes the outlaw take an involuntary step backward. There's something in the priest's stance, in the way his scarred hands rest easily at his sides, that sends a warning signal through Jake's mind. A predator's recognition of another predator. "Peace?" Father Thomas's voice carries a weight that seems to fill the church. "Is that what you call burning down the Miller widow's store when she couldn't pay? Or breaking young David Cooper's hands when he tried to defend his sister's honor?" The twins shift uncomfortably, but Jake's face darkens with anger. His hand moves to his gun belt. "You know what, Father? I think it's time for a lesson in respect. Tonight at sundown, you and me in the street. We'll let God decide who's right." A heavy silence fills the church. Father Thomas looks down at his hands, Hands that haven't touched a gun in 5 years, hands that have since only offered blessing and comfort. In his mind, he sees flashes of his past life, the glint of steel, the thunder of gunfire, the faces of those who fell before his legendary draw. "Violence solves nothing, Mr. Morgan," he says quietly, though his fingers twitch almost imperceptibly. "I gave up that path long ago." Jake's grin turns cruel. "Ain't giving you a choice, Father. Either meet me at sundown, or this pretty little church of yours might have an accident. Lots of dry wood in here. Be a shame if something caught fire during evening prayers." As the Morgan brothers turn to leave, their boot heels echoing on the wooden floor, Father Thomas remains motionless at the altar. Once they're gone, he slowly reaches beneath his cassock, touching the small silver cross he wears. A cross that covers a faded bullet scar from the day he decided to change his life. In the empty church, Father Thomas closes his eyes and whispers a prayer, not for deliverance from this challenge, but for forgiveness for what he knows he must do. The morning sun continues to stream through the stained glass, painting the altar in hues of red and gold, as a man of peace confronts the violent skills of his past. The news of the impending duel spreads through Saint's Cross like wildfire, carried on whispers from the general store to the saloon, from the blacksmith's forge to the schoolhouse. Father Thomas goes about his daily duties, each step measured and deliberate as he visits his parishioners. To anyone watching, he appears untroubled by the morning's confrontation, but his mind wrestles with memories he'd hoped to leave buried. Sarah Cooper, the town's schoolteacher, catches up to him as he leaves the Martinez family's sickbed. Her face bears the concern of someone who's known him since his arrival in Saint's Cross 5 years ago. "Father, I heard about what happened at the church. The Morgan brothers. They're dangerous men. Perhaps we should send for the marshal in Silver Springs." Father Thomas pauses beneath the shade of an old oak tree, its branches casting dappled shadows across his features. "The marshal won't arrive in time, Sarah. Besides, this is a matter between me and Mr. Morgan." His voice carries a weight she's never heard before, an authority that seems to come from somewhere deeper than his religious calling. "There's something else, isn't there?" Sarah studies his face, seeing past the calm exterior to the conflict beneath. "Sometimes, when you think no one's watching, I see how you look at the gunfighters who pass through town. Not with fear, not with disgust, but with recognition." The priest's silence speaks volumes. Finally, he turns to her, his eyes carrying the weight of untold stories. "We all have pasts we'd rather forget, Miss Cooper. The question is not what we were, but what we choose to be now." As they walk through town, Father Thomas notices subtle changes in the atmosphere. The usual friendly greetings are tinged with uncertainty. Parents pull their children closer as he passes. Even old Jim Parker, who never misses a Sunday service, averts his eyes when their paths cross outside the general store. Inside Hawkins' general store, the usual afternoon chatter dies down as Father Thomas enters. He approaches the counter where Edgar Hawkins, a man who's known him for all 5 years of his ministry, suddenly seems intensely interested in reorganizing his tobacco inventory. "Something troubling you, Edgar?" Father Thomas asks quietly. Hawkins glances up, then back down. "Begging your pardon, Father, but... well, there's talk about who you might have been before you came to Saint's Cross. Some folks are saying..." He trails off, uncomfortable. "That I might be someone other than who I claim to be." Father Thomas completes the thought. The store owner's silence is answer enough. As if summoned by the tension, the saloon doors across the street burst open. Bill Morgan, the younger of the twins, staggers out into the afternoon sun. His voice carries clearly through the store's open door. "Hey, Father, got a question for you about that good book of yours. That commandment about not killing, does it count if you're doing the Lord's work?" Laughter erupts from the saloon, harsh and mocking. Father Thomas remains still, but those close enough might notice how his scarred hands tighten almost imperceptibly on the counter's edge. In that moment, a memory surfaces unbidden, a similar scene from years ago when he was a different man. The same mocking laughter, the same challenge in the air. But then his response had been swift and final, leaving 3 men dead in a Kansas saloon and adding to the legend of Ghost Hand McGraw. "You know what I heard?" Bill continues, emboldened by whiskey and his audience. "Heard tell of a gunslinger out in Kansas territory a few years back. Real religious fellow, too. Used to quote scripture while he killed folks. They called him the preacher of death." The store falls completely silent. Even the creaking of the wooden floorboards seems to hold its breath. Father Thomas turns slowly, facing the drunk gunman across the street. Their eyes meet through the dust-filled air, and for just a moment, something dangerous flickers across the priest's features, a shadow of someone else. Someone Bill Morgan wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. "Your brother set the time for sundown, Mr. Morgan," Father Thomas says, his voice carrying clearly despite its quietness. "I suggest you save your questions for then." Something in his tone makes Bill Morgan step back, suddenly more sober than he was moments ago. The young gunman retreats into the saloon, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken truths. Sarah Cooper, who has watched the entire exchange, steps closer to Father Thomas. "I've never seen you like this," she whispers. "It's as if you're becoming someone else." Father Thomas looks down at his hands, hands that have blessed children and tended the sick, hands that have also dealt death with frightening efficiency. "Not becoming, Miss Cooper, remembering, and that's what troubles me most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As afternoon shadows lengthen across Saint's Cross, Father Thomas returns to his sparse quarters adjacent to the church. The room reflects his current life of simplicity, a narrow bed, a worn wooden desk covered in religious texts, and a single chair. But beneath the floorboards, hidden from sight, lies a leather-wrapped bundle he hasn't touched in 5 years. A matched pair of Colt revolvers with pearl handles, their blued steel still pristine despite years of burial. He kneels beside his bed, not in prayer this time, but to lift the loose floorboard. The familiar weight of the guns brings a flood of memories. Each pearl handle bears a small cross carved into its base, a detail that once earned him mockery from fellow outlaws until they witnessed what those hands could do. The crosses were his signature, his attempt to find redemption even in his darkest days. A knock at his door breaks his reverie. "Enter," he calls, quickly returning the weapons to their hiding place. Sheriff Marcus Reed steps inside, his expression grave. The sheriff is a good man, but young, too young to have heard the stories of Ghost Hand McGraw firsthand. "Father, I've been talking with folks in town. They're scared, the Morgan brothers. They've never pushed things this far before." Father Thomas gestures for the sheriff to sit. "Tell me what you know about them, Marcus, not the rumors, but the facts." The sheriff removes his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "They showed up about 8 months ago, while you were away on your mission to the Apache territories. Started small, offering protection to merchants, taking a cut of the profits. But lately—" He pauses, choosing his words carefully. "3 nights ago, they burned down the Miller widow's store. Last week, they beat young Cooper so badly he might never have full use of his hands again. And there are whispers about other things. Missing travelers, unmarked graves out in the desert. And you haven't arrested them because—" "Because I'm one man, Father. One man with a deputy who's barely more than a boy, against 3 killers and whatever hired guns they can afford with the money they've squeezed from this town." The sheriff's voice carries the weight of his helplessness. "I sent for help from the territorial marshal, but by the time help arrives, there might not be much of a town left to save," Father Thomas finishes. The sheriff nods, then leans forward. Father, some of the old-timers in the saloon, they've been talking, say they recognize something in the way you carry yourself, the way you move. They say you remind them of stories they heard years ago about a gunfighter who... Father Thomas raises a hand, stopping him. The past is the past, Sheriff. What matters is the present and what we choose to do with it. But if those stories are true, the sheriff hesitates. If you really are who they say, why did you stop? Why become a priest? Father Thomas moves to the window, gazing out at the town he's come to love. The evening light paints the adobe buildings in shades of gold and crimson, like the gates of heaven touched by hellfire. 5 years ago, in a town not unlike this one, I killed a man. Not in self-defense, not for money, but because he challenged me. Because my pride demanded it. As he lay dying, he looked up at me and said, "I hope you find peace." Those were his last words. Not a curse, not a threat, but a blessing. It broke something in me, Sheriff. Or perhaps it fixed something that had been broken for a long time. The sheriff absorbs this in silence, understanding the weight of the confession. Finally, he stands. The Morgan brothers won't show you the same mercy, Father. Jake Morgan especially. He's been bragging in the saloon about adding a priest's collar to his collection of trophies. I know. Father Thomas turns from the window, his expression resolute. Which is why I need you to do something for me, Marcus. When sundown comes, keep everyone away from the street. Whatever happens, whatever you hear, keep them inside. You're going to face him then? I'm going to do what needs to be done. Father Thomas's voice carries the finality of judgment. But first, there's a confession I need to hear. Would you send Jake Morgan to me? Tell him. Tell him if he wants to know who I really am before our meeting, he'll find me in the church. The sheriff pauses at the door, and if he refuses, he won't. Father Thomas's lips curve in a smile that belongs more to his past than his present. A man like Jake Morgan can't resist the chance to torment a priest before killing him. His pride won't allow it, and pride, Sheriff Reed, has always been the deadliest sin of all. The church's interior grows darker as evening approaches, shadows lengthening between the pews like reaching fingers. Father Thomas lights the altar candles one by one, each flame pushing back the encroaching darkness. The methodical action calms his mind, much as checking his guns once did in another life. Behind him, the church door creaks open, then closes with a heavy thud. Jake Morgan's spurs ring against the wooden floor, each step deliberate and menacing. He stops halfway down the center aisle, his figure silhouetted by the dying sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. "Your sheriff said you wanted to see me, Father. Said you had something to confess." His voice carries a mocking edge. "Thought that was supposed to work the other way around." Father Thomas continues lighting candles, his movements unhurried. "Every man has his confessions, Mr. Morgan, even those who think themselves beyond redemption." He turns to face his visitor, his expression serene despite the tension filling the sacred space. "Tell me, how many men have you killed?" The question catches Morgan off guard. He shifts his weight, hand instinctively moving closer to his gun. "Ain't exactly kept count, Father. Ain't exactly the type to say my Hail Marys after each one neither." 37. Father Thomas's voice is quiet, but carries clearly in the church's acoustics. "That's your count. I made inquiries after you arrived in town. 17 in fair fights, if such things can be called fair. The rest weren't even given the chance to draw." Morgan's eyes narrow. "Been keeping mighty close track for a man of the cloth. Perhaps because I once kept a similar count myself." Father Thomas moves away from the altar, his steps measured as he approaches the outlaw. Kansas territory, 1878. A saloon in Dead River Junction. 3 men died that day. A card cheat named Collins and his 2 companions. You heard the story earlier, though your brother got some details wrong. They didn't call me the preacher of death. Recognition dawns in Morgan's eyes, followed quickly by disbelief. No, he whispers, you can't be. Ghost Hand McGraw disappeared 5 years ago. Some say he died in Mexico. Others say he went mad and walked into the desert. The truth is often less dramatic than the stories men tell. Father Thomas stopped several paces from Morgan. I laid down my guns and picked up a different calling, found a different kind of salvation. Morgan's laugh is sharp and bitter. Salvation. There's no salvation for men like us, Father. Or should I say, McGraw, we're killers, that's all we'll ever be. You're wrong. Father Thomas's voice carries the weight of hard-won wisdom. Every soul has the capacity for change, even yours, Jake Morgan. I've seen your kind before, men who mistake cruelty for strength, who build empires on the fear of others. I was like you once, believing my skill with a gun gave me the right to play God. And now you think wearing that collar makes you better than me? Morgan's hand tightens on his gun belt. You're still the same killer. You've just found a fancier way to dress it up. No, Mr. Morgan, the collar doesn't make me better. The choices I make do. Father Thomas gestures to the church around them. This place, these people, they've shown me there's more to life than the reputation of a gunfighter, more than the momentary power of holding another man's life in your hands. Morgan takes a step forward, his face twisted with contempt. Pretty words from a man who's about to die. When we meet at sundown, all your fancy talk about redemption won't mean a thing. A gun don't care about salvation. Then why are you here? Father Thomas asks quietly. If you're so certain of victory, why accept the sheriff's invitation? Perhaps because deep down you needed to know. Needed to be sure that the man you're facing isn't just another small-town priest. The question hangs in the air between them. Morgan's confidence wavers for just a moment, replaced by something that might be fear. Knowing who you are changes nothing. When the sun goes down, I'm still going to kill you. Perhaps. Father Thomas turns back toward the altar. Or perhaps God has a different plan. After all, he brought you here to this church at this moment. Even if you don't believe in redemption, Mr. Morgan, redemption believes in you. Morgan backs away, his earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. At the door, he pauses. You're wrong about one thing, McGraw. I didn't come here to confirm who you are. I came to tell you that after I kill you, I'm burning this church to the ground, with your congregation inside it. Sometimes a man needs to make an example. The threat hangs in the air like gun smoke. Father Thomas remains still, but those who knew him in his previous life would recognize the subtle shift in his stance. The ghost of Ghost Hand McGraw, emerging from beneath the priest's calm exterior. Then you've made my choice easier, Mr. Morgan. Father Thomas's voice carries an edge that hasn't been heard in 5 years. I'll see you at sundown, and may God have mercy on your soul, because I'm no longer sure I can. As the sun begins its final descent toward the horizon, Saint's Cross takes on the eerie stillness of a town holding its breath. The usual evening activities have ceased. No children playing in the dusty streets, no ranchers heading to the saloon for their customary drinks, no merchants closing up their shops. Instead, doors are bolted, windows shuttered, and prayers whispered behind locked doors. In his church quarters, Father Thomas kneels before his simple wooden cross. His priest's collar lies on the bed beside his neatly folded black cassock. He wears a simple white shirt now, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with the scars of his former life. The hidden bundle from beneath the floorboards rests before him, its leather wrapping aged but well preserved. A soft knock interrupts his contemplation. "Enter," he calls, not moving from his position. Sarah Cooper steps inside, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. She pauses at the sight of him. Without his priestly garments, he looks different, dangerous, in a way she's never noticed before. "The women of the congregation sent these," she says, setting the package down. "Clean bandages. They said they remember what happened the last time the Morgan brothers were challenged." Father Thomas rises slowly, his movements carrying a fluid grace that seems at odds with his usual measured pace. "The Morgan brothers won't be hurting anyone else after tonight." Sarah watches as he unwraps the leather bundle, revealing the twin Colts. Even she, with little knowledge of firearms, can see these are no ordinary weapons. Their pearl handles gleam in the fading light, the carved crosses catching the sun's last rays. "All this time," she whispers, "when you spoke of redemption in your sermons, of the possibility of change, I spoke from experience." He checks each gun with practiced efficiency, the movements automatic despite 5 years of disuse. "Every word was true, Miss Cooper. Change is possible, redemption is real, but sometimes—" He pauses, looking up at her. "Sometimes God asks us to take up our old burdens for a greater purpose." "The children ask about you," she says suddenly. "The ones you've been teaching to read. Little Maria Martinez wanted to know if you'll still be here for her first communion next month." The words hit him harder than any bullet. His hands still on the guns. "I've tried to avoid violence, Miss Cooper. Tried to show another way. But men like Morgan only understand one language. And what about the language you've been teaching us these past 5 years? About mercy? About turning the other cheek?" Father Thomas slides the guns into the holsters with a decisive click. Sometimes mercy requires strength. Sometimes turning the other cheek means standing firm against evil. He buckles on the gun belt, the familiar weight settling on his hips like a remembered sin. The Morgan brothers threaten to burn the church with the congregation inside. They've moved beyond simple greed into true evil. If I don't stop them now, their darkness will consume this town. A commotion outside draws their attention. Through the window, they see Bill Morgan dragging old Jim Parker into the street, throwing the elderly man roughly to the ground. "Hey, Father!" Bill shouts, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Found this one trying to sneak out of town. Thought maybe he was going for help." Father Thomas moves to the door, but Sarah grabs his arm. "They're trying to provoke you, to make you face them angry, make you make a mistake." "No," Father Thomas says quietly. "They're trying to prove I'm still the man I used to be, that the priest is just a mask worn by a killer." He gently removes her hand. "What they don't understand is that both men are real, the priest and the gunfighter, the seeker of peace and the dealer of justice. God led me to this moment for a reason." He steps out into the street, the setting sun casting his shadow long before him. Bill Morgan has drawn his gun, holding it casually pointed at Jim Parker's head. The old man kneels in the dust, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. "Let him go, Mr. Morgan," Father Thomas calls, his voice carrying the same authority it holds during Sunday sermons. "Your quarrel is with me." Bill's face twists into a cruel smile. "But we got time to kill before sundown, Father. Thought maybe we'd have some fun first. Show these good people what happens when they don't respect their betters." "The sun is low enough," Father Thomas says, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "If you're so eager to meet your Maker, we can begin now." A hush falls over the street. Even the wind seems to die, leaving only the sound of Father Thomas's boots on the hard-packed earth as he walks forward. Each step carries the weight of inevitability, the measured pace of judgment approaching. Bill Morgan's smile falters as he recognizes something in the priest's walk, the casual grace of a born gunfighter, the absolute confidence of a man who has faced death so many times it has become an old friend. The setting sun paints the street in shades of amber and crimson, casting long shadows that stretch like accusing fingers across the dusty ground. Bill Morgan's confidence wavers as Father Thomas approaches, the priest's measured steps carrying an authority that transcends his religious office. The gathered townsfolk, watching from behind partially closed shutters and doorways, sense the shift in the air, the moment when predator becomes prey. "You seem eager to start the festivities early, Mr. Morgan," Father Thomas says, his voice carrying clearly in the evening stillness. "But a man of your experience should know that timing is everything, especially when it comes to matters of life and death." He stops 30 paces from Bill, his hands still hanging loosely at his sides. The pearl-handled Colts catch the dying sunlight, their carved crosses gleaming like judgment made manifest. Bill's gun hand trembles slightly as he keeps his weapon trained on old Jim Parker. "Stay back, Father, or the old man gets to meet his maker ahead of schedule." But his voice lacks conviction, and those watching closely might notice how he takes half a step backward, unconsciously responding to some primal instinct that recognizes superior danger. "I've noticed something about you, Bill Morgan," Father Thomas continues, as casual as if he's delivering a Sunday sermon. "You're always hiding behind someone else, behind your brother's reputation, behind helpless victims. I wonder, have you ever faced a man on equal terms? Ever trusted in your own skill rather than another's weakness?" The words strike deeper than any bullet. Bill's face flushes red with anger and embarrassment. "You think wearing that gun belt makes you something special? You're just another prayer-spouting hypocrite who's about to learn that God don't stop bullets." In one fluid motion, Bill shoves Jim Parker aside and levels his gun at Father Thomas. The movement is fast, faster than most men could match. But before his weapon fully aligns, Father Thomas's right hand moves in a blur that seems to defy natural law. The first Colt appears in his grip as if conjured there by divine intervention. The sound of the shot rolls across the street like thunder. Bill Morgan's gun goes spinning from his grip, along with 2 fingers from his right hand. He stares in shock at his maimed hand, then at the priest, who hasn't moved from his position, gun held low and steady, a thin trail of smoke curling from its barrel. "5 years ago," Father Thomas says quietly, "I would have put that bullet through your heart. Be grateful that time and God's grace have taught me mercy." His eyes, hard as steel, despite his words of compassion, lock onto Bill's. "Now, Mr. Morgan, I suggest you seek medical attention. Your brother and I have unfinished business to discuss." From the saloon doorway, a slow clapping breaks the tension. Jake Morgan steps into the street, his silver-plated revolvers catching the last rays of sunlight. "Impressive, Father, or should I say, ghost hand. I was starting to wonder if the legends were true." He looks at his wounded brother with contempt. "Get yourself to the doctor, Bill. You've embarrassed me enough for one day." As Bill Morgan stumbles away, cradling his bleeding hand, Jake advances into the street. His confidence seems unshaken by his brother's defeat, his movements controlled and deliberate. "You know, I heard stories about Ghost Hand McGraw. They said you never drew first, never killed a man who hadn't challenged you. Called it your code of honor." His lips curl in a mocking smile. "Looks like that code slipped a bit, Father, drawing on a man before sundown, shooting him before he could properly aim." "Your brother drew first, Mr. Morgan. As you well know." Father Thomas holsters his gun with the same liquid grace with which he drew it. "And if you're concerned about codes of honor, perhaps we should discuss your treatment of this town's citizens, or your threat against my congregation." Jake Morgan's eyes narrow. "You want to talk about honor? Let's talk about a man who made his reputation killing others, then tried to hide behind a priest's collar. At least I'm honest about what I am." He spreads his arms wide, indicating the empty street. "Look around, Father. See how your flock hides from the violence? How they cower behind their doors while you break your vows of peace? What kind of shepherd brings wolves to his sheep's door? A shepherd who knows that sometimes the wolf must be confronted, Father Thomas replies, his voice carrying notes of both steel and sorrow. You forced this moment, Mr. Morgan. Remember that when you meet your maker. The sun touches the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of fire. Jake Morgan's hand hovers near his gun. Sunset's almost here, Father. Time to see if God's on your side, or if he's got better things to do than save fallen priests. The last rays of sunlight paint Saint's Cross in shades of blood and gold, casting long shadows that stretch between Father Thomas and Jake Morgan like bars of darkness. The town holds its collective breath, windows and doorways filled with watching eyes. Even the wind has died down, as if nature itself awaits the outcome of this confrontation. Father Thomas stands perfectly still, his cassock and collar replaced by the simple white shirt and dark vest of his former life. The pearl-handled Colts rest in their holsters, their carved crosses catching the dying light. Across from him, Jake Morgan affects a casual stance, but his eyes never leave the priest's hands, hands that had moments ago demonstrated why they once earned the name Ghost Hand. You know what makes a great gunfighter, Father? Jake's voice carries across the empty street, confident despite his brother's defeat. It's not speed, though that helps. It's not accuracy, though that's important too. It's conviction, the absolute certainty that your life matters more than the other man's. He takes a step forward, silver-plated guns gleaming. That's why I'm going to win, because while you're wrestling with your conscience, wondering if God will forgive you for killing again, I'll be putting bullets through your righteous heart. You're wrong, Mr. Morgan. Father Thomas's voice remains steady, carrying the same authority it holds during Sunday services. A great gunfighter isn't made by conviction in himself. He's made by conviction in something greater. In my past life, I thought that something was reputation, or skill, or the power over life and death. I was wrong. His eyes meet Morgan's, unflinching. True strength comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're willing to die for. Pretty words from a dead man. Morgan's smile turns cruel. But words won't save your congregation when I burn this town to the ground. Maybe I'll start with that school teacher who seems so fond of you, or those children you've been teaching to read. I want you to die knowing that everything you tried to protect will turn to ash. A change comes over Father Thomas's expression, subtle but profound. Those who knew him in his previous life would recognize it. The moment when Ghost Hand McGraw fully emerges from behind the priest's peaceful facade. That's where you're wrong again, Mr. Morgan. I'm not going to die, and you've just removed my last doubt about what must be done. Sarah Cooper, watching from the church steps, sees the transformation. In that moment, she understands that the man before her isn't just Father Thomas playing at being his former self, nor is he Ghost Hand McGraw pretending to be a priest. He is both, and neither, something new forged from the union of his past and present. Enough talk. Morgan's hands hover near his guns. Time to see if your God can turn bullets aside. God doesn't need to turn bullets aside, Mr. Morgan. Father Thomas's voice carries an edge of steel beneath its calm surface. He just needs to guide one true. The street falls silent, save for the distant toll of the church bell marking sundown. For a heartbeat, time seems to stretch like molasses. Then several things happen in rapid succession, so fast that witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence of events. Jake Morgan draws both his silver-plated revolvers in a motion that has killed a dozen men before. His speed is remarkable, his accuracy legendary. But before his guns clear leather, Father Thomas's right hand moves in that same ghostly blur that had disarmed his brother. The pearl-handled Colt seems to materialize in his grip, as if called there by divine intervention. Two shots ring out, so close together they sound like a single thunderclap. Morgan's bullets kick up dust on either side of where Father Thomas was standing, but the priest has somehow shifted 2 inches to the left, a movement so subtle and quick it seems impossible. His own shot, guided by skill or providence or both, strikes true. Jake Morgan looks down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his chest directly over his heart. His silver-plated guns slip from nerveless fingers. "How?" he manages to whisper. "The difference between us," Father Thomas says quietly, holstering his smoking gun, "is that I never took joy in killing. Every man I sent to meet his maker weighed on my soul. That weight taught me when to fire." He walks forward as Morgan sinks to his knees, and more importantly, when not to. Jake Morgan pitches forward into the dust of the street. The setting sun catches the silver of his guns one last time before darkness claims them. In the deepening twilight, silence blankets Saint's Cross like fresh fallen snow. The echo of the fatal shot still seems to hang in the air, a ghostly reminder of the moment when justice and mercy met in the dust of the street. Father Thomas stands motionless, the pearl-handled Colt still warm in its holster, as the town holds its collective breath. Sheriff Marcus Reed is the first to move, stepping out from the shadows of the jail with his deputy close behind. He approaches Jake Morgan's body with practiced caution, though there's no doubt about the outcome. The legendary gunfighter's silver-plated revolvers lie untouched in the dirt, their owner's final expression one of perpetual surprise. "It's done," the sheriff announces, his voice carrying in the evening stillness. The words seem to break a spell, and slowly, cautiously, the townsfolk begin emerging from their shelters. They gather at a respectful distance, their whispered conversations creating a soft counterpoint to the coming night. Father Thomas hasn't moved from his position, his eyes fixed on the man he was forced to kill. Sarah Cooper approaches him slowly, as one might approach a wild creature. "Father?" she asks softly. "Are you—" "I'm fine, Miss Cooper," he interrupts, though his voice carries a weight that wasn't there before. "But I believe there are matters that need attending to." He turns toward the gathering crowd, his movement causing several people to step back involuntarily. The transformation they witnessed, from peaceful priest to deadly gunfighter and back again, has shaken their understanding of the man they thought they knew. "The Morgan brothers' men," Father Thomas addresses the sheriff. "There were at least 6 of them staying at the saloon. They'll need to be dealt with before they decide to avenge their employer." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupts from the saloon's direction. The remaining outlaws burst through the swinging doors, guns drawn. But before anyone can react, Father Thomas's voice cuts through the chaos with the same authority he uses to deliver his sermons. "Gentlemen," he calls out, not reaching for his weapons, "your employer lies dead. His brother is wounded and will face justice for his crimes. You have a choice to make." He takes a step forward, and despite his peaceful stance, several of the men take an instinctive step back. "You can leave this town now, alive and free to seek honest work elsewhere. Or you can try to avenge the Morgan brothers and join them in the grave. Choose carefully. I've filled enough graves for one day." Something in his voice, perhaps the absolute certainty, perhaps the hint of sorrow for what he might be forced to do, convinces them. One by one they lower their weapons. There. The sheriff and his deputy move forward to collect their guns, and within minutes the men are mounting their horses, eager to put distance between themselves and the man who killed Jake Morgan. As the thunder of hooves fades into the distance, the townsfolk begin to close in around Father Thomas. Their expressions are a mixture of awe, fear, and uncertainty. Old Jim Parker, still sporting a bandage from his encounter with Bill Morgan, is the first to speak. "All this time," the elderly man says, his voice trembling slightly, "all these years you've been teaching us about peace and forgiveness. Was it all a lie?" Father Thomas turns to face his congregation, and in the failing light they can see both the priest and the gunfighter in his bearing. Every word was true, he says quietly. Perhaps truer because they came from a man who knew the weight of violence, who had seen where the path of vengeance leads. He looks down at his hands, hands that had brought both death and blessing. The lessons I taught about redemption weren't theory. They were bought with blood and paid for with years of seeking forgiveness. Sarah Cooper steps forward, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. The Bible speaks of time for peace and a time for war, of turning the other cheek, but also of driving the money changers from the temple. She looks around at her neighbors. Today, Father Thomas drove the money changers from our temple. He protected his flock the only way he could. A murmur of agreement ripples through the crowd. The simple truth of her words seems to ease some of the tension, though questions still hang heavy in the air. Father Thomas looks toward his church, its spire silhouetted against the darkening sky. There will be time for explanations, he says. Time for questions and answers. But first, we have duties to attend to. The dead must be seen to with respect, regardless of their sins. The wounded must be cared for. And then... He pauses, touching the cross that still hangs around his neck. Then we must pray. For Jake Morgan's soul, for our own, and for the wisdom to know when justice requires action and when it requires restraint. Night has fallen over Saint's Cross, but sleep eludes its inhabitants. Lanterns burn in windows across town as people gather in homes and the saloon, speaking in hushed voices about the day's events. The church stands as a silent sentinel in the darkness, its stained glass windows glowing softly from the candlelight within. Inside the sanctuary, Father Thomas kneels before the altar, his gun belt placed beside him like an offering, the pearl-handled Colts reflecting the flickering flames of dozens of votive candles. The familiar scents of beeswax and incense fill the air, but tonight they seem to mingle with another odor, the faint, acrid smell of gun smoke that still clings to his clothing. Even after years of serving God, he hasn't forgotten that smell, just as his hands haven't forgotten the weight of his guns. The past and present intertwine like shadows in the candlelight, each demanding its due. The door creaks open behind him, and Sheriff Reed's boots echo on the wooden floor. The lawman pauses halfway down the aisle, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment. Bill Morgan's wound has been tended to, he reports, his voice respectfully quiet in the sacred space. Doc Stevens says he'll keep the use of his hand, though those 2 fingers are gone for good. He's under guard at the clinic, but I don't think he'll be causing any more trouble. The fight seems to have gone out of him completely. Father Thomas remains kneeling, his response barely above a whisper. And his brother... We've prepared Jake's body properly. Some of the townspeople are already working on a coffin. Despite everything he did, they want to ensure a decent burial. The sheriff pauses, then adds, "They're saying it's what you would have wanted, though I admit some folks are still struggling to reconcile the priest they knew with the man they saw in the street today." "They're right about the burial," Father Thomas says, finally rising to face the lawman. The candlelight casts shifting shadows across his features, making him seem both more and less than the man the town had known. "Every soul deserves dignity in death, Sheriff, even those who showed none in life. In fact, perhaps they need it most of all." The sheriff shifts uncomfortably, his hand resting on his own holstered weapon. "Father, there's something else. Word of what happened is spreading faster than a prairie fire. 2 riders just came in from Silver Springs saying they heard Ghost Hand McGraw had returned. By morning there'll be more. Curious onlookers, newspapermen, maybe even..." He hesitates, reluctant to voice the obvious concern. "Other gunfighters," Father Thomas finishes, a trace of weariness creeping into his voice. "Men looking to make a name for themselves by challenging the legend. Young guns eager to prove themselves against the man who killed Jake Morgan, or old enemies seeking to settle ancient scores." He walks to the first pew and sits heavily, the weight of understanding clear in his bearing. The very thing I sought to leave behind when I took my vows. Violence begets violence, Sheriff. That's one of the hardest lessons I've learned in my life. The church door opens again, admitting Sarah Cooper and several other prominent townspeople. They approach cautiously, respect and uncertainty mingling in their expressions. Martha Wilson, who has played the church organ for 20 years, steps forward, her hands clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The lamplight catches the silver in her hair, reminding Father Thomas of how many births, deaths, and marriages she has marked with her music in this very sanctuary. "We've been talking, Father," she begins, her usually strong voice trembling slightly, "about everything that's happened, about who you were, who you are." She glances at the others for support before continuing. "We want you to know that it doesn't change anything. What you did today, it wasn't just about being Ghost Hand McGraw. It was about being our priest, protecting your flock, like the good shepherd who defends his sheep from the wolves." Father Thomas looks up at them, seeing the sincerity in their faces, the trust warring with their natural human fear of what they had witnessed. "It changes everything, Mrs. Wilson. I took vows of peace, vows to serve God and this community. Today I broke those vows, took up arms, and killed a man. Whatever my reasons, whatever good came of it, that truth remains. The blood on my hands isn't just Jake Morgan's, it's also the blood of every man I've ever killed, rising up to remind me of who I once was." "But surely God understands," Sarah interjects, moving closer despite the tension in the room. "Surely he sees that you had no choice. The Morgan brothers would have destroyed everything we've built here, everything you've taught us about faith and community." "There's always a choice, Miss Cooper." Father Thomas stands, moving to the window where the street is visible, the spot where Jake Morgan fell, now marked by a dark stain in the dirt. 5 years ago, I chose to lay down my guns and seek redemption. Today, I chose to take them up again. Both choices carried consequences. Both demanded a price. The question isn't whether the price was worth paying. It's whether I can continue to serve God and this community, knowing that the violence still lives within me, that the skills and instincts of Ghost Hand McGraw remain just beneath the surface of Father Thomas's calm exterior. The dawn breaks over Saint's Cross with an unusual commotion. Where normally the town would be stirring slowly to life with the routine sounds of merchants opening their shops and ranchers heading out to their daily tasks, today brings the thunder of approaching hooves and the excited voices of newcomers. Father Thomas stands at his church window, watching as the first wave of curiosity seekers arrives from neighboring towns. Sheriff Reed appears at his side, his expression grave. "Exactly as we feared, Father. I count at least 30 new faces already, and the sun's barely up. Newspaper men from as far as Denver, if the talk in the saloon is accurate, and those are just the ones we can see." He hesitates before adding, "There are others watching from the shadows, men with hard eyes and well-worn gun belts. They're not here for the story, they're here for the legend." Father Thomas observes the growing crowd in the street, his expression unreadable. The pearl-handled Colts rest in their holsters at his hips. He hasn't removed them since yesterday's confrontation, knowing that to do so might invite disaster. "How many gunfighters have you spotted?" he asks quietly. "At least 5 that I'm certain about, 2 at the saloon, 1 staying at the hotel, and a pair camping just outside town." The sheriff's hand unconsciously moves to his own weapon. They're all young, eager to make their reputation by challenging the man who killed Jake Morgan, who proved he really is Ghost Hand McGraw. "They don't want Ghost Hand McGraw," Father Thomas says, his voice carrying a weight of understanding. "They want the legend, the myth. They've heard the stories. 37 men killed in fair fights, never drawing first, never losing a duel. They don't understand that those stories were built on blood and regret, not glory." Sarah Cooper enters the church carrying a stack of newspapers from nearby towns. The headlines scream in bold type, "Ghost Hand Returns. Legendary gunfighter revealed as frontier priest and deadly dawn in Saints Cross. Notorious gunman kills again." She places them on a pew with evident distaste. "They're turning it into some kind of dime novel adventure," she says, her voice tight with anger. "They don't mention the Morgan brothers' crimes or how they terrorized our town. They just want to sensationalize the violence." Father Thomas picks up one of the papers, scanning its lurid description of yesterday's events. "They're creating a narrative that will bring more trouble. Every young gun and veteran killer within 100 miles will read these words and see an opportunity, some for fame, others for revenge." As if to punctuate his words, a commotion erupts outside. Through the window they can see two men arguing in the street, their voices carrying clearly in the morning air. One is a local rancher, the other a newly arrived stranger with a distinctive red bandana and a well-maintained Remington on his hip. "I'm telling you, I knew Ghost Hand McGraw in his prime," the stranger announces loudly, clearly playing to the growing crowd. "Rode with him for a spell in '78. Man was as cold as ice, killed without a second thought. This priest has to be an imposter. The real Ghost Hand would never hide behind a collar." Father Thomas watches the scene unfold, his expression darkening. "He's trying to draw me out," he says quietly. "Force me to prove myself, and he's not the last who will try such tactics." The sheriff moves toward the door, but Father Thomas stops him with a gentle hand on his arm. "No, Marcus. This is my burden to bear." He straightens his shoulders and walks to the church entrance, each step measured and deliberate. The crowd parts as he emerges into the morning sunlight. The stranger with the red bandana turns to face him, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, if it ain't the holy man himself. Care to comment on my story, Father? Maybe explain how a stone-cold killer like Ghost Hand McGraw found his calling with the good Lord." Father Thomas stops at the bottom of the church steps, his hands loose at his sides. When he speaks, his voice carries clearly across the suddenly silent street. "I never rode with anyone in '78, Mr. Clayton, Luke Clayton." The stranger's hand moves closer to his gun. "And are you calling me a liar, Father?" "I'm saying that a man who would use lies to force a confrontation might want to reconsider his choices." Father Thomas's voice remains calm, but there's an edge to it that makes several onlookers step back, especially when those choices might lead him down a path he can't step back from. Clayton's face flushes red. Sounds like the words of a coward hiding behind his collar. "The Ghost Hand I heard tell of wouldn't waste time with warnings." "The Ghost Hand you heard tell of was a myth, Mr. Clayton. A story told in saloons by men who never met him. The reality." Father Thomas's eyes meet Clayton's, and something in that gaze makes the younger man's confidence waver. "The reality is standing before you, offering you a chance to walk away. I suggest you take it." The morning sun climbs higher over Saints Cross, its heat beginning to shimmer off the packed earth of the street where Father Thomas and Luke Clayton face each other. The gathering crowd maintains a respectful distance, their collective breath held as they watch the tension build between the two men. Clayton's hand hovers near his Remington, his earlier bravado somewhat diminished by the steady gaze of the priest before him. "You're offering me a chance to walk away?" Clayton's laugh carries a nervous edge. "That's mighty generous of you, Father, but I've got a different proposition. Why don't you prove to all these good folks that you're really who they say you are? Show them the legendary Ghost Hand McGraw hasn't gone soft behind that collar." Sheriff Reed moves to intervene, but Father Thomas raises a hand to stop him. "Mr. Clayton, in the past 24 hours, I've been forced to shoot one man and kill another. Each action weighs heavily on my soul. Do not make the mistake of thinking my reluctance to draw stems from fear or weakness." The crowd stirs at these words, remembering the lightning-fast draw that had disarmed Bill Morgan and the deadly precision that had ended Jake's life. Several of the visiting gunfighters, watching from the shadows of the saloon, exchange meaningful glances. They see what Clayton, in his youthful arrogance, has failed to notice: the absolute stillness in Father Thomas's stance, the careful positioning that would allow him to draw and fire in a single fluid motion. "Pretty speeches won't protect your reputation, Father," Clayton persists, though his voice has lost some of its certainty. "Way I hear it, Ghost Hand McGraw never backed down from a challenge, never let another man's words go unanswered. And that pride cost 37 men their lives," Father Thomas responds, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. 37 souls sent to judgment because of words spoken in anger or wounded pride. Would you like to be the 38th, Mr. Clayton? Is your desire for reputation worth dying for? A murmur runs through the crowd. Sarah Cooper, watching from the church steps, sees several of the townspeople nodding in understanding. They're witnessing not just a confrontation between two men, but a battle between two ways of life. The violent code of the frontier and the path of peace their priest has taught them. Clayton's face flushes red with anger and embarrassment. "You can't hide behind sermons forever. Sooner or later someone's going to call your bluff. Might as well be me." His hand moves closer to his gun, fingers flexing with nervous energy. "I'm not hiding, Mr. Clayton. I'm standing in plain sight, giving you every chance to choose a better path." Father Thomas's voice takes on the same tone he uses during Sunday services, filled with authority and compassion. "Ask yourself, what do you truly hope to gain here? If you draw against me and lose, you die for nothing more than wounded pride. If by some chance you win, you'll have killed a priest in cold blood, and that sin will haunt you for the rest of your days." The logic of these words seems to penetrate Clayton's bravado. His hand wavers near his gun as uncertainty crosses his features. In that moment of hesitation, Father Thomas continues, his words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "There's no honor in this challenge, Mr. Clayton, no glory to be won, just the possibility of death or damnation. I've walked the path you're contemplating, and I can tell you it leads nowhere but to more violence, more death, and eventually, if you're fortunate enough to live that long, to the crushing weight of regret." The morning wind stirs the dust in the street, carrying with it the sound of hammering from the undertaker's shop, where Jake Morgan's coffin nears completion. The sound serves as a pointed reminder of how quickly life can end when pride and gunsmoke mix. Clayton's eyes dart between Father Thomas's face and the pearl-handled Colts at his hips. The carved crosses on their handles catch the sunlight, seeming to glow with inner fire. Finally, his hand drops away from his weapon. "Maybe," he says, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe you're right, Father. Maybe there's no percentage in dying for pride." He takes a step backward, then another. "But don't think this is over. Others will come, men who won't be talked down with sermons and wise words." "I know," Father Thomas replies quietly. "They always do. But perhaps some of them will also choose to hear wisdom over violence. Each soul saved from darkness is a victory in God's eyes, Mr. Clayton. Remember that when you ride out of here today." As Clayton pushes through the crowd toward his horse, the tension in the street begins to dissipate. But Father Thomas's expression remains troubled, knowing that this is only the first of many such confrontations to come. The legend of Ghost Hand McGraw, awakened by yesterday's events, will draw others like moths to a flame. As Clayton's horse disappears into the distance, the crowd in Saints Cross begins to disperse, their excited whispers carrying through the morning air. Father Thomas remains on the church steps, watching as several other gunfighters slip away from their observation points around the square. Their departure brings no relief, for he knows they are merely retreating to consider their own strategies after witnessing Clayton's failure. Sheriff Reed approaches, his expression grave. "That was well handled, Father, but I'm concerned. 3 more riders just came in from the north, and the telegraph operator tells me he's been receiving messages asking about you all morning. Word of yesterday's events is spreading faster than we anticipated." "The vultures are circling," Father Thomas responds, his voice carrying a weight of understanding. "Each man who leaves will spread the story, and each telling will draw more attention. It's a cycle I'm familiar with, Sheriff, one I had hoped never to see again." Inside the church, Sarah Cooper and Martha Wilson are organizing a meeting of the town council. The pews fill quickly with prominent citizens, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern and determination. Father Thomas enters quietly, taking a position near the altar, rather than his usual seat at the head of the gathering. Theodore Banks, the town's most successful merchant, rises to address the assembly. "We need to discuss the situation at hand. Our town is filling with dangerous men, all drawn here by—" He pauses, glancing uncomfortably at Father Thomas. "By recent events. The safety of our community is at risk." "The safety of this community has always been at risk," Sarah interjects, her voice sharp. "Have we forgotten so quickly what it was like under the Morgan brothers? How we lived in fear of their demands and violence. Father Thomas defended us when no one else could or would." A murmur of agreement ripples through the gathering, but Banks persists. "No one disputes the service he did us yesterday, but now we face a different kind of threat. Every gunfighter looking to make a name for himself will be drawn here, turning our streets into a proving ground for their deadly ambitions." Father Thomas steps forward, his movement drawing all eyes. "Mr. Banks speaks truth. My past has brought danger to your doorstep, and for that I owe you all an apology. Perhaps it would be best if I were to leave Saints Cross, draw this attention away from the town." The suggestion brings immediate protest from several quarters. Martha Wilson rises from her seat at the organ, her voice carrying the authority of her many years in the community. "Leave? After 5 years of service? After building this congregation, teaching our children, bringing hope to those who had none? No, Father, we will not sacrifice our shepherd to the wolves." "Mrs. Wilson's right," Sheriff Reed adds. "These men, they're not just coming for you, Father. They're coming for the legend of Ghost Hand McGraw. If you leave, they'll likely follow, but some will stay, thinking to draw you back by threatening the town. We've seen such tactics before." The truth of his words settles heavily on the assembly. Father Thomas moves to the church window, observing the street where more curious onlookers are gathering. Among them, he notices several hard-faced men who carry themselves with the unmistakable bearing of experienced gunfighters, men far more dangerous than young Clayton. "Then we must find another way," Father Thomas says finally, "a way to end this cycle of violence before it consumes everything we've built here. The Morgan brothers forced my hand, but I will not allow their deaths to destroy the peace we've worked so hard to achieve." He turns back to the assembly, his expression resolute. "I took vows before God and this congregation, vows of peace, of service, of protection. Yesterday I was forced to break the first to uphold the others. Today we must find a path that honors all 3. A young voice pipes up from the back of the church, Timothy Parker, the blacksmith's son. "Father, in your sermon last month, you spoke about David facing Goliath, about how sometimes standing firm against evil requires more than just faith. Were you thinking of this moment even then?" The question brings a thoughtful smile to Father Thomas's face. "God's wisdom often reveals itself in unexpected ways, Timothy. Perhaps I was preparing myself, and all of you, for the trial we now face. But remember the full lesson of that sermon. David's victory came not just from his skill with a sling, but from his absolute faith in the righteousness of his cause." The afternoon sun bears down on Saint's Cross as Father Thomas stands at his church window, observing the transformation of his peaceful town. The streets have grown crowded with unfamiliar faces, their presence casting a shadow darker than any cloud. Among them move three distinct types: the curious onlookers drawn by sensational newspaper accounts, the hardened gunfighters seeking to test their skills against a legend, and the townspeople attempting to maintain their daily routines amid this growing chaos. Sheriff Reed enters the church, accompanied by his deputy and two prominent ranchers. Their expressions convey the gravity of their latest report. 4 more gunfighters arrived within the last hour, Father, the sheriff announces, his voice tight with concern. These aren't young hotheads like Clayton. 2 of them I recognize from wanted posters, professional killers who've worked as hired guns across 3 territories. Father Thomas turns from the window, his movement carrying the measured grace that marks him as both priest and gunfighter. They're testing our defenses, Marcus. Watching, waiting, looking for patterns or weaknesses they can exploit. Each one hopes to be the man who brings down Ghost Hand McGraw, but they're careful enough to learn from Clayton's mistake. Sarah Cooper arrives with fresh reports from the telegraph office, her normally neat appearance showing signs of strain. Messages are arriving from as far as Kansas City, she reports, holding up a stack of papers. Newspapers are offering rewards for exclusive interviews with the gunfighter priest. One publisher in Denver is already advertising a dime novel about your life. Vultures feeding on violence, Father Thomas responds, his voice carrying notes of both weariness and determination. Each story will draw more attention, more challenges, more potential for bloodshed. We must find a way to end this before it spirals beyond control. The church door opens again, admitting Martha Wilson and Theodore Banks. The unlikely alliance between the church organist and the merchant speaks to the gravity of the situation. We've finished our survey of the town, Banks reports. Most businesses are willing to close early, bringing their people in before sundown. The hotel owner has agreed to stop renting rooms to obvious gunfighters, though some are camping outside town limits. And the families? Father Thomas inquires, his concern evident. Martha Wilson steps forward. We're organizing household groups. No one walks the streets alone anymore, especially the children. The school has been temporarily relocated to the basement of the general store. Fewer windows, more secure. Father Thomas absorbs these reports with a growing sense of responsibility. The town he had sworn to protect is effectively under siege, transformed into an armed camp by his presence. The weight of his dual roles, priest and gunfighter, has never felt heavier. There may be another way, Sarah suggests carefully. The territorial marshal's office has replied to our telegraph. They're offering to send a detachment of deputies, perhaps even the marshal himself, with official law enforcement present. It would only add fuel to the fire, Father Thomas interrupts gently. These men aren't common criminals to be scared off by badges. They're hunters, drawn by the scent of reputation and the chance for glory. Official intervention would only convince them that Ghost Hand McGraw has grown too weak to face his challenges alone. The truth of his words settles heavily on the gathering. Through the window, they can see more riders approaching from the east, their intentions yet unknown but easily guessed. The situation grows more volatile with each passing hour. Sheriff Reed clears his throat. There's something else, Father. Bill Morgan's condition has stabilized enough for questioning. He's been asking to speak with you. Says he has information about some of the men who are coming, former associates of his brother who might be seeking revenge rather than reputation. Father Thomas considers this development carefully. Revenge can be an even more dangerous motivation than ambition. Did he say anything specific? Only that a man named Santiago is among those approaching. The name seemed to worry him considerably. The mention of Santiago causes a subtle shift in Father Thomas's demeanor, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in his normally fluid movements that suggests recognition. Santiago, he repeats softly. I should have expected him. Some debts, it seems, refuse to remain buried in the past. Sarah notices the change in his bearing. You know this man? I know of him, Father Thomas responds carefully. He was a legend in his own right along the Mexican border. They called him the surgeon for his precision with a gun and his habit of wounding rather than killing at first. His victims often wished for a quicker death by the time he finished with them. The implications of this revelation cast a deeper shadow over the already grave situation. Father Thomas moves to the altar, his steps measured and deliberate. We've been addressing symptoms rather than the cause, he says finally. These men come because they believe Ghost Hand McGraw has returned. Perhaps it's time to show them how wrong they are and how right at the same time. Father Thomas kneels before the altar as the afternoon light streams through the church's stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across his features. The pearl-handled colts rest before him, their carved crosses catching the light. The church remains silent, save for the distant sounds of the town, preparing for whatever may come. In this moment of contemplation, his thoughts turn to the approaching storm that Santiago's arrival represents. Sheriff Reed enters quietly, his footsteps echoing in the sacred space. Bill Morgan's provided more details about Santiago, he reports, keeping his voice low out of respect for the setting. Says the man's been tracking Ghost Hand McGraw for years, following rumors and stories, building a network of informants across the territories. The Morgan brothers' deaths finally gave him what he needed, confirmation that the legend still lived. Father Thomas rises slowly, his movements carrying the weight of memory. Santiago and I crossed paths once before, Sheriff. 7 years ago in a border town called Purgatorio. He had been terrorizing the local population, using his skills with a gun to extort and torture. I was still Ghost Hand then, still believing that violence could solve violence. What happened? The sheriff asks, though his expression suggests he already anticipates the answer. I wounded him severely, shot the gun from his right hand, taking 3 fingers with it. He survived, but his reputation was shattered. A man like Santiago, he lives for his reputation even more than most gunfighters. I left him alive, thinking it was mercy. Perhaps that was my greatest mistake. Sarah Cooper appears at the church door, her face carrying news that cannot wait. Father, riders approaching from the south, 6 men, led by someone matching Santiago's description. They're moving slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone sees them coming. Father Thomas moves to the window, observing the approaching riders. Even at a distance, he recognizes the lead figure, a tall man riding a black horse, his right hand encased in a black leather glove. Santiago's presence commands attention, his very posture suggesting contained violence. He's changed his tactics, Father Thomas observes quietly. The Santiago I knew worked alone, prided himself on personal combat. Bringing others suggests he's learned from our last encounter. He won't risk a fair fight this time. Theodore Banks hurries into the church, his usual merchant's composure shaken. They're stopping at every business along the main street, he reports. Asking questions about you, Father, about your habits, your schedule, making it clear that anyone who helps you will face consequences. Attempting to isolate us, Sheriff Reed concludes. Turn the town against you through fear. Father Thomas turns from the window, his expression resolute. No. He's trying to force my hand, make me face him on his terms. Santiago knows that as a priest, I cannot stand by while others suffer for my sake. He's counting on that conscience to drive me into the open. Martha Wilson, who has been quietly organizing the church records, speaks up. Then perhaps it's time to show him that a priest's conscience can be a more formidable weapon than any gun. You've built something here, Father. Not just a congregation, but a community. We've seen both sides of you now, the man of peace and the man of action. Perhaps that combination is exactly what's needed. Father Thomas considers her words carefully. You may be right, Mrs. Wilson. Santiago expects to find Ghost Hand McGraw hiding behind a priest's collar. Instead, he'll find something he doesn't understand, a man who has genuinely changed, supported by a community that understands both redemption and justice. He moves to the altar, picking up his gun belt but not yet buckling it on. Send word through town. I want every business closed, every door locked, every citizen inside within the hour. Not out of fear, but out of choice. Let Santiago and his men find themselves facing not just one man, but the unified will of an entire community. Sheriff Reed nods in understanding. A show of solidarity rather than submission. But Father, if they start threatening people, breaking into buildings, then they'll learn another lesson that Santiago has forgotten, Father Thomas responds, his voice carrying the authority of both his callings. A shepherd's duty is to protect his flock by whatever means necessary. I took vows of peace, yes, but also vows to serve and defend this community. Sometimes those vows conflict, and in such moments we must choose the greater good. The sun hangs low over Saint's Cross, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seem to mirror the tension building in the streets below. Santiago and his men have positioned themselves strategically throughout the town, their presence a dark counterpoint to the sacred hour of evening prayers. The buildings stand silent and shuttered, every door locked, every window closed, not in fear, but in quiet defiance of the violence these men represent. Father Thomas stands at the church door, watching as Santiago dismounts his black horse in the center of the street. The years have changed his old adversary. The once proud gunfighter now moves with a predator's careful grace, his gloved right hand a constant reminder of their last encounter. 5 other men spread out behind him, their hands hovering near their weapons. I must admit, Padre, Santiago calls out, his voice carrying a hint of his Mexican heritage, you've created quite the spectacle here. The legendary Ghost Hand McGraw, hiding behind a priest's collar, playing at redemption. It would be amusing if it weren't so pathetic. Father Thomas descends the church steps, his movements measured and deliberate. The pearl-handled Colts rest at his hips, their carved crosses catching the dying light. You're wrong, Santiago. I'm not hiding behind anything. The man you knew died years ago, replaced by something you may not understand. A man who found purpose beyond the power of the gun. Santiago's laugh is sharp and bitter. Purpose. Let's speak truth to each other, McGraw. You and I, we're men of blood. Your fancy words and noble intentions don't change what you are, what you proved yourself to be when you killed Jake Morgan. The only difference between us is that I admit what I am. The difference, Father Thomas responds quietly, is that I chose to change, to seek redemption, not through denial of my past, but through acceptance of a different future. Something you could have done after our last meeting if you hadn't let pride and hatred consume you. Santiago's face darkens at the reference to their previous encounter. His gloved hand flexes unconsciously. Redemption. Let's test the depth of your conviction, Padre. My men have orders. If I fall, they'll burn this town to the ground, starting with your precious church. How does your redemption account for that? By understanding that true redemption sometimes requires sacrifice. Father Thomas's voice carries clearly in the evening air. You're right about one thing, Santiago. I am both the priest and the gunfighter, the man of peace and the dealer of justice. God led me to this moment not to deny either role, but to understand how they serve his purpose. As if in response to his words, movement appears in the windows and doorways of the surrounding buildings. The townspeople emerge, not in fear but in solidarity, forming a circle around the confrontation. Sheriff Reed and his deputy take positions to control Santiago's men, while Sarah Cooper and the other town leaders stand as witnesses to whatever may come. Santiago's eyes narrow as he realizes the situation has shifted, touching McGraw. But do you really think these sheep can protect you? That their presence changes anything about what must happen here? They're not here to protect me, Santiago. They're here to bear witness to a choice, your choice. You can turn away from this path, as I did. Find a better way to live the years remaining to you, or you can die here, another victim of the violence that consumes men like we once were. For a moment, something flickers in Santiago's eyes, perhaps recognition of the truth in these words, perhaps just the last glimmer of humanity in a soul consumed by vengeance. Then his gloved hand moves with shocking speed, drawing his gun in a motion that has killed countless men. But Father Thomas has already moved, his right hand a blur that seems to defy natural law. The pearl-handled Colt appears as if by divine intervention, its report thundering in the evening air. Santiago's gun goes spinning away, along with the glove that had hidden his maimed hand. 7 years ago, I shot the gun from your hand, taking your fingers as payment for your crimes, Father Thomas says quietly, his weapon unwavering. I left you alive, hoping you would learn from the experience. Today, I could aim 6 inches higher and end your threat forever. The choice, once again, is yours. Santiago stares at his exposed hand, then at the man who had twice now proved superior. His men, seeing their leader disarmed and at another's mercy, begin to back away. The moment stretches, heavy with possibility, until Santiago's shoulders slump in defeat. Perhaps, he says finally, his voice rough with emotion, there is something to your talk of redemption after all, Padre. Something I never understood until this moment. As the sheriff moves to take Santiago into custody, Father Thomas returns his gun to its holster. The townsfolk begin to emerge fully from their positions, moving to reclaim their streets from the shadow of violence. Sarah Cooper approaches him, her expression questioning. You knew he would draw first, she says. You counted on his pride to make him act against his own interests. I counted on God to show him a better path, Father Thomas corrects gently. Whether through my words or my actions, the choice was always his to make. He looks out over his congregation, seeing in their faces understanding of the complex truth he represents. A man of God who carries the weight of his past, not as a burden, but as a tool for his purpose. As the sun sets over Saint's Cross, Father Thomas returns to his church. The pearl-handled colts, their carved crosses now bearing witness to both justice and mercy, will return to their place beneath the floorboards. Tomorrow, there will be services to conduct, souls to counsel, and a community to heal. But for now, in the gathering darkness, a former gunfighter turned priest offers a prayer of thanksgiving for the power of redemption and the infinite capacity of God's grace to transform even the hardest of hearts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.